Well, hello there. I'm so glad you've joined me tonight. We're about to wander down a frost-bitten path into a time when winter wasn't just cold. It could feel almost relentless. Think of the hush of fresh snow under gaslit street lamps, the sparkle of ice on window panes, and yet the way that same beauty could cut right through you to the bone. I'll share stories of handy-knit mittens stiff with frost, of midnight brick warmers, of neighbors knocking on doors with casseroles, when the world outside seemed all white silence. Before we slip on our scarves and step outside, I'd be honored if you'd like or subscribe only if these quiet journeys speak to you. And please leave a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it on your clock? There's something comforting about knowing we're all tucked in under our own blankets, sharing the same chilly night air. So, dim the lights, let a fan whisper in the background, and join me as we ask, why were winters so much harder? I wake to the soft glow of dawn filtering through ice-covered window panes that look like delicate lace crafted by winter itself. The air feels sharp as it slips around my shoulders and into my lungs before I pull the quilt tighter against my chin. I could stay nestled forever, but Mama's voice soon drifts down the hallway to rouse me for another day of frost and wonder. The floor feels like a slab of marble under my bare toes, and I tiptoe across it until the small vent warms my feet with a gentle puff of heat. Steam rises where I press my socks against the grate, and I imagine it dancing away to greet the morning light. Outside, the world waits in silent white stillness. The fields beyond our fence are sheeted in snow, and the trees stand with branches bowed under their own weight. It is beautiful and brutal all at once, and I remember even then feeling that cold had a secret grace wrapped in its bite. I slip on wool tights next, then a sweater that belonged to my cousin and carries the faint scent of cedar from the hall closet. There is no hurry, and yet every layer is a kind of careful armor. I pause by the window, breath framing the glass as I study the frost patterns swirling along the edges. I wonder why those winters seemed harder when I was small, why I felt each chill more deeply than I do now. Perhaps it was freedom bound in a frozen world, or the fierce delight of discovery in every frost-covered blade of grass. That first frost of autumn always felt like a promise whispered in the dark hours before dawn. I remember the night air growing taut and still, as if the world were holding its breath for something extraordinary. I woke to find every blade of grass outlined in ice crystals that caught the moonlight and turned our yard into a shimmering gallery. The maple leaves, still clinging stubbornly to their branches, glowed with a pale silver dusting, as though they had been painted by some unseen artist. I slipped from my bed, toes curled against the cold floor, and tiptoed to the window in nothing but my nightgown. Mama must have sensed my eagerness because she was right behind me, her robe trailing softly across the hardwood. We pressed our faces to the glass together, marveling at the transformation. I could hear the old furnace humming somewhere in the distance, a steady reminder that warmth was waiting inside. Yet I felt no desire to move until I had memorized every glint and swirl the frost offered. When morning arrived, we found footprints around the porch me brothers, Charlie and mine, where we had crept outside after we thought we were unseen. In the weak light of early morning, our breath rose in little clouds, and our laughter rang crisp against the quiet. The world felt new and fragile and infinite all at once. Even now, I can feel that frost's first bite on my cheek, a gentle urgency that reminded me winter was not just coming but inviting us to wake up and watch the slow unfolding beauty of a season that would test every ounce of our resourcefulness. There was a certain ceremony to dressing for the cold that felt as important as any holiday tradition. I'd begin with a pair of long underwear soft cotton that brushed my skin with a faint scent of laundry soap. Next came the wool tights, snug and slightly scratchy where they pressed against my knees. I'd wrap on thick socks, 2 pairs if the day promised sub-zero temperatures, and then pull on my sturdy boots that creaked with each step. Over my legs went corduroy pants that Mama had hemmed just long enough to cover the tops of my shoes. Then came the layers on my torso. A thin cotton shirt, a knit sweater whose yarn had begun to pill, and finally the heavy coat that had once wrapped my older cousin before finding its way to me. I'd wrestle the stiff zipper until it yielded, breathing a quiet sigh of victory. The scarf came next, looped twice around my neck until only my eyes showed, and the hat perched on my head with ear flaps tied under the chin to block gusts of wind. Mittens, though always damp inside, completed the ensemble, and I admired my reflection in the hallway mirror before venturing out. Each layer felt like an embrace, a snug promise that I could face whatever the wind and snow would throw my way. Yet I understood even as a child that those layers were both protection and barrier shielding me from the bite of winter while reminding me how fierce it could be. Standing fully bundled, I would feel equal parts invincible and humbled by the chill that seeped even through all those warm folds. A memory that stays with me in every sweater I still pull on today. The morning alarm never rang in our house on winter days. Instead, I'd wake to Mama's gentle holler echoing down the hall, calling me to rise before the school bus froze in place. My feet hit the floor and I gasped as the cold stone yanked warmth from my toes. I'd hop in place, clutching my quilt around my shoulders while I flung aside the covers. The wind whistled through the cracks in the window frame, and I could almost hear the trees creaking under their icy burden. Every movement felt urgent, as though the chill sought to claim me before I could properly arm myself against it. I'd shuffle across the frozen linoleum, ripping at my nightgown until I could shimmy into my long johns and wool tights. Each layer felt like reclaiming a small portion of comfort from the morning's bite. By the time I reached the kitchen, the scent of oatmeal and syrup greeted me like a lifeline. Mama stood at the stove in her robe, steam rising around her as she stirred the bubbling pot, her hair wrapped in a scarf to protect the curlers beneath. She smiled at my red cheeks and rattling teeth, setting a bowl of hot oats before me. I huddled over that steam, spoon in hand, savoring warmth pooling in my belly. For a moment, I forgot the cold at my heels. But as soon as the last oats vanished, reality returned. The promise of a warm bus seat or a heated classroom felt distant at best. I wrapped my scarf tight and exhaled into the morning air, ready at last to face a day that might test every bit of that hard-earned armor. Climbing into a coat that was never quite your size felt like stepping into someone else's history, yet somehow claiming it for your own. I remember the coat I inherited from my cousin had a zipper that caught on the lining, requiring a careful tug and a whispered apology before it would slide shut. The sleeves were too long, so I folded them back until they stayed in place, revealing the brightly patterned lining my cousin had once adored. Mama mended the fraying cuff with a patch of navy fabric she cut from an old dress, and for years I wore that coat proud of every stitch and seam. Scarves came next, none of them ever matching my mittens or hat, but each with its own story. One was knitted by Grandma Elsie in a rainbow of yarn scraps she found while quilting. Another was blue wool that Mrs. Crandall had knit when her fingers were too stiff to do anything else. I wrapped them around my neck until only a narrow slit of vision remained, the cold wind slipping in through every loose loop. And though the ensemble looked more hodgepodge than fashionable, I felt wrapped in love. Every tug at a zipper and every patch sewn over a worn spot reminded me that warmth was a gift passed between hands. Walking down the snowy sidewalks in that mismatched armor, I felt connected to everyone who had come before me and everyone who would follow. In those moments, a coat was more than protection against ice. It was a story I carried with me every time I stepped into the winter world. Every morning when I stepped into the hallway, I'd find a small puddle of moisture glistening beneath the radiator vent where last night's mittens had been perched like frosty soldiers awaiting orders. Mama taught me early on that warming damp gloves was a matter of honor. No one wanted cold fingers for the long walk to school. I'd kneel before that grate, pulling off one mitten at a time and holding them close until the steam curled around my wrists, softening the damp wool inside. The air shimmered where my breath met the rising warmth, and I'd close my eyes for a moment, imagining the heat soaking into every fiber. Sometimes Charlie and I competed in silence, each of us guarding our own secret stash of mittens beneath our coats, so the other couldn't claim the prime spot. He'd dart down the hall in stocking feet, only to be met by my determined tug on the corner of that cast iron vent, and we'd both laugh quietly, careful not to wake Mama. Those few seconds by the radiator became a ritual, a small oasis of comfort before the world rushed by in gusts of wind and clattering school buses. Even now, whenever I feel winter's bite at my fingertips, I recall that gentle vent in the hall, the hiss of warm air, and the soft reward of slipping back into mittens kissed by warmth. Pulling on my boots became its own small adventure each morning, battling stiff leather and frozen laces that snapped a little when you tugged too hard. I'd brace one foot on the hall bench, leaning forward until the boot's opening softened enough to slide my sock toes in. The leather felt cold and rigid at first, then gradually relaxed as I eased my foot deeper. Sometimes the soles were so packed with snow that I couldn't feel the ground beneath me, and I'd wobble into the kitchen, gingerly testing each step until my balance returned. Mama always had a damp rag nearby to wipe away the worst of the melting ice, so I wouldn't track a slippery mess across the floor. Once the boots were on, the real journey began. The walk to the bus stop led me through drifts that rose above my ankles, turning each stride into a slow climb. I learned to stamp my feet deliberately, crunching the snow solid before moving forward, and to lean slightly into the wind so I wouldn't be knocked off balance by its sudden gusts. My boots squeaked and sighed with each step, the sound echoing against the silent white banks. Despite the struggle, there was comfort in knowing that every careful step brought me closer to warmth. I imagined my breath knitting a trail behind me, a ribbon of mist that marked my passage through the frozen world. By the time I reached the street corner, the morning's effort felt like a ritual communion with winter itself, a reminder that even when the cold seemed endless, each step forward was its own quiet triumph. Each morning felt like stepping into a private world carved by giants as I made my way through the towering walls of snow piled along our street. The plow operator had heaped drifts so high that only the very top of our mailbox peeked out, and I had to climb over a ridge that felt as tall as a castle wall just to reach the sidewalk. My friends and I performed our own version of an expedition, trudging single file and stamping down the snow until a narrow path emerged beneath our feet. The walls on either side rose above our heads, casting long shadows even when the sun glowed bright. Our breaths formed clouds that hurried ahead of us, floating off and dissolving into the crisp air. Every handful of snow we kicked aside revealed a compact layer beneath, a reminder that the frozen world had many layers of its own. There was something thrilling about navigating those snow canyons, as if we were explorers charting territory no one else had seen since last winter's thaw. Occasionally, I would pause to press my hand against the cold wall, feeling its solid chill through my gloves and marveling at how heavy and real it seemed. And yet there was comfort in that enclosure too, because it meant the community beyond it had rallied together, clearing a path that let life carry on despite the storm. By the time I reached the bus stop at the end of our makeshift tunnel, my cheeks glowed pink and my coat was speckled with flying crystals. In that moment, I understood how those snowdrift canyons taught me about persistence and solidarity, how even the most formidable barriers could be overcome step by careful step. On cold mornings when the sky was still a pale shade of dawn, I always looked forward to seeing Mr. Luby standing at his corner post with his little red flag in hand. He wore the same thick brown coat with a fur collar that seemed too warm for anyone else, but perfect for a midday blizzard. His eyebrows were rimmed with frost so white they glowed like winter lanterns, and he never missed a wave or a smile for any of us, even when the wind tried its hardest to steal our breath away. As he guided us across the street, he called out names and offered gentle reminders. "Mind the ice there," or "Keep your scarves tight," his voice carrying confidence that we might make it safely into the schoolhouse. I remember the way he tapped his toe against the ground to keep warm, sending little clouds of steam up into the air with every shift. Sometimes he would lean on his shovel, a battered tool with a wooden handle that he kept in pristine shape, and share bits of neighborly gossip or a weather forecast that sounded more like a prophecy than a prediction. The world outside those snow walls felt unpredictable, but Mr. Luby's presence made it feel as though each single step had been planned and watched over by someone who cared. Even as the cold bit through my layers, I felt protected in that moment, as though I had a guardian perched on the curb just for me. and though I hardly ever thanked him out loud, I carried his kindness with me all day, tucked deep inside the cozy folds of my winter coat. The moment the school's double doors swung open, warmth rushed toward me like a welcoming wave. Steam billowed out from inside, carrying the scent of chalk dust and damp wool, and I felt my cheeks thaw almost instantly. I trudged past dripping coats hanging on metal hooks, each one letting fall little puddles that hissed against the rubber mat below. The cloakroom smelled of wet mittens, wooden cubbies, and the faint hint of last night's shoe polish. I peeled off my scarf and unzipped my coat, letting it drop onto the nearest hook before rushing into the classroom's gentle heat. The old radiator along the wall glowed orange through a grate, and I pressed my palms against its iron face until the red spots on my fingertips blurred into warmth. My breath no longer formed clouds, and for the first time that morning I could feel my toes again. The teacher's desk sat at the front beside a blackboard whose chalk lines looked soft in the humid air. A globe turned lazily in the corner where sunlight filtered through curtains patched with plastic to keep drafts out. I slid into my seat, the wooden surface smooth beneath my still-cold fingers, and watched as classmates shook the last flakes of snow from their coats. The hush that fell was not the silence of fear, but of relief, a shared comfort in being out of the wind. In that cocoon of heat, I felt the day's possibilities stretch out before me. Lessons to learn, mysteries of arithmetic to uncover, and even the promise of a steaming bowl of soup at lunch. It was a reminder that warmth wasn't merely a luxury, but a bridge between the frozen world outside and the steady rhythm of childhood inside. I settled into my desk each morning with a soft sigh as the chill of the corridor gave way to the gentle warmth of the classroom. The blackboard stood tall at the front, its satin surface still cool to the touch. When the teacher tapped chalk against its edge, the white dust burst into a tiny cloud that drifted in the sunbeam like a mini snowstorm. The faint grit tickled my nose and settled on my eyelashes, mixing with the last traces of cold tears that lingered from the walk to school. Scrubbing the board clean after class was a task I volunteered for when I wanted to feel useful. I gripped the chalk with chalky fingertips and danced the eraser side to side until the lines vanished. Each swipe released another puff of chalk dust, and for a moment the air turned thick and soft, like a winter fog lifting off a snowfield at sunrise. I imagined the board breathing out every lesson learned, every problem solved, every question asked. Once the surface was smooth again, I used a damp cloth to gather the remaining powder, feeling the reassuring warmth of the cloth as it smoothed across the board. I held the chalk in my palm, the small stick now marked by dimpled fingerprints and tiny white chips, as though it had absorbed a bit of every day's discovery. That ritual felt like a promise that knowledge could chase away the chill, that inside those walls the world was made of ideas instead of ice. And for a few shining moments, I believed that any problem could be erased as easily as chalk dust, leaving nothing but a blank slate waiting for new wonders to appear. When the lunch bell rang, the hallways filled with the shuffle of heavy boots and the murmur of classmates eager for a moment of warmth. I carried my lunch pail past rows of lockers and into the cafeteria where steamy aromas met me at the door. Today's special was tomato soup served in cafeteria bowls that felt almost too hot to hold, the rich red liquid swirling with flecks of black pepper and a hint of basil that reminded me of summer gardens long since tucked under snow. I cradled my bowl between mittened hands, careful not to drip a single drop onto my wool coat before settling into a chair at a long table with my friends. The first spoonful was always the best moment of the day. The deep tang of tomatoes warmed my tongue while the steam curled around my face like a comforting blanket. Saltines arrived on small paper plates, crisp and waiting to be broken into perfect triangles. I would dip one into the soup until it softened just enough to release a mellow saltiness into the broth. We ate slowly, savoring each bite and trading stories of icy playground slides and the morning's most treacherous patches of sidewalk. Laughter echoed off the painted walls as we compared frozen mitten mishaps and declared who had the coldest nose. In that bright, crowded room, the chill from outside seemed to evaporate, replaced by the simple joy of shared mealtime and the promise of warmth in every spoonful. By the time the bowls were empty and the last crumb of cracker had been swept away, I felt renewed and ready for the afternoon ahead, a reminder that a humble bowl of soup could thaw more than just frozen fingers. It could soothe the soul and knit friends closer together. We turned the schoolyard into a battleground of snow forts and secret tunnels where alliances formed and loyalties shifted with every white missile launched into the cold air. By midday, the field looked like a frozen chessboard marked with trenches carved by small hands determined to conquer territory inch by inch. I remember crouching behind a mound of snow, heart pounding, as I spotted an opening near the swing set. My breath came in quick little puffs that glittered like frost in the winter light. I gathered a handful of snow, compacting it into a tight sphere before letting my arm swing back and hurl it forward. The snowball whistled through the air and struck wide of its target, spraying a mist of icy crystals that stung my cheek and sent a burst of laughter rippling through my group. We ducked behind ramparts hastily reinforced with backpacks and lunchboxes, plotting our next move. There was an unspoken rule that once you were hit, you joined the other side, so friendships could change with a single throw and alliances shifted faster than the wind. When I finally felt that gentle thud against my coat, I climbed out of my hideout and joined the victorious team, my boots crunching loudly over the packed snow as I ran. The world narrowed to the bright white snow underfoot, the warm flush on my cheeks, and the thrill of a momentary escape from the routine of school and shivering walks home. For a few glorious minutes, winter's sting felt like play rather than punishment, and I understood why those snowy skirmishes remained vibrant memories. Each flake transformed into laughter and camaraderie. By the time the lunch bell rang, my hands were already craving the comforting weight of my lunch pail, its metal edges warmed from the lingering heat of Mama's stove. I carried it down the frosted hallway, careful to avoid dripping melted snow onto the worn tile. Inside was a thermos of cocoa so hot it steamed the air when I unscrewed the cap, the sweet aroma carrying memories of Saturday mornings by the fireplace. Beside it lay a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, its bread still soft despite the bitter cold outside. Sometimes I traded a corner of my sandwich for a classmate's orange slices, their tart juices bursting like tiny suns against the winter gray. Other days, I swapped a sugar cookie Mama had baked at dawn for a friend's sweet pickled beets, the tang surprising against the warmth of chocolate. We gathered at long wooden tables, mittens off at last, sleeves rolled up to catch stray drips of cocoa that clung to the edge of the bowl like tiny ice sculptures. Laughter rose above the hum of steam as we compared frozen lips and tepid sips, each of us knowing that this simple ritual carried us through the afternoon. I savored each swallow of cocoa, feeling how it wound warmth from my tongue down to my toes. Even the breadcrumbs that fell onto the tabletop seemed to sparkle with possibility, promising energy for the battles of arithmetic and spelling that awaited us. And when the bell rang again, I tightened my scarf, flipped the lid of my pail closed, and stepped back into the corridor, renewed by the small feast. That midday respite taught me that nourishment in winter was as much about shared warmth and companionship as it was about bread and chocolate. By the time the noon bell rang, I'd clutch my lunch pail like a lifeline against the biting air. My mother always packed a thermos of hot cocoa that steamed through the crack at the lid, promising a brief oasis of warmth. I'd twist off the cap and let the rich chocolate scent rise before pouring the liquid into the little cup that doubled as its own lid. The first sip felt like summer sunshine breaking through a snowstorm, and I closed my eyes to savor the heat spreading through my chest. My sandwich, pressed between thick slices of homemade bread, was usually slathered with cold butter and jam that resisted my teeth like a frozen fortress. I learned to bite the crust first, warming the center with cocoa-soaked lips before tackling the middle. Sometimes I traded bites with Carol Ann peanut butter and honey for her cheese sandwich each swap, a negotiation born of necessity and childhood camaraderie. We sat at our favorite spot on the concrete steps outside the cafeteria, the sun's pale rays barely softening the chill, but enough to let us forget the wind whipping our scarves. Around us, classmates cracked open their own thermoses, sharing sighs of relief as the warmth thawed their fingers. We talked about the morning's math problems, the next snow day rumor, and whose boots had succumbed to frostbite first. The laughter echoed off the brick walls while our breath drifted skyward in little clouds of white. For a fleeting half hour, the cold became a distant afterthought, replaced by the simple joy of shared warmth and friendship. And as I finished the last crumb and sipped the final drop of cocoa, I felt fortified against the afternoon's returning bite, ready to carry that small pocket of heat back inside my layered coat. I still wince at the memory of that icy dare. Though it happened so long ago, I can almost pretend it wasn't me. It was a frigid morning in December when Charlie and his gang insisted the metal doorknob would be the perfect test of courage. I watched from inside the threshold as he pressed his tongue against the frozen brass, expecting a quick chill but finding instant regret. His face twisted in shock as the doorknob claimed him firmly in its grip, his tongue stuck fast, and his eyes wide with panic. Mama was in the kitchen frying eggs when she heard his muffled yells and came running, apron swinging and curlers rattling. She rushed to his side, pressing her gloved fingers to the knob to warm it, whispering gentle reassurances until his tongue released with a painful snap. Charlie hobbled into the house with a red mark on his tongue and a lesson learned in the most humbling way. After thawing, he swore off dares forever. But I couldn't shake the image of that brass knob shining in the sun, a silent sentinel of winter's cunning tricks. For years afterward, whenever I reached for an outdoor latch, I tapped it first with the back of my glove, half expecting it to bite. That single moment of childhood bravado became a touchstone in my memory, a reminder that winter's beauty could turn itself into play or pain with the slightest misstep. I learned then that winter demanded respect, that the smallest moment of curiosity could leave its mark long after the snow melted. The trek home felt different than the morning's brisk dash to school, as if the snow that softened the day's edges also whispered secrets underfoot. I remember the hush lingering after the final bell, our breath pooling in silver puffs that floated above the snowbanks like drifting feathers. The sun hung low, casting the world in pale gold that reflected off every flake and made the snow gleam like a scattered treasure trove. Carol Ann walked beside me, her mittened hand brushing against mine when she pointed out the perfect drift for making letters in the snow. We stenciled our names in capital letters, watching as the wind whispered across the troughs and smudged our work into abstract art. The sidewalks were slick in places, and I learned to shuffle my feet like a careful dance, heels sliding forward before the ball of each foot locked in place. Sometimes, if I felt brave, I'd push off and glide a step or two, feeling weightless before gravity coaxed me back down. The distant hum of the school bus faded behind us, leaving only the soft crunch of snow and the occasional creak of branches overhead. My coat grew heavy with flakes that melted slowly against my shoulders, but I welcomed each one, imagining they carried pieces of that golden light into the folds of my layers. By the time I reached our front gate, the day's remaining warmth seemed tucked into every snowmelt where sunlight had kissed the drifts. I lifted my scarf to catch one final puff of frosty air and felt a quiet promise that even as winter tested us, it also gave moments of unspoken wonder. Evenings in winter held a special kind of magic when the sky had turned ink black and stars glittered overhead like scattered diamonds. In those hours, Mama would light the small lamp on the kitchen table and open jars of cinnamon and nutmeg, the rich scents weaving through the cold air that slipped in around the window frame. I'd sit on the counter in my nightgown while she mixed butter and sugar until the bowl whispered under her wooden spoon. Flour dusted the tabletop like fresh snow, and every sprinkle sent little clouds drifting upward. We rolled out dough until it was as thin as a handkerchief, then cut shapes that reminded me of snowflakes and holly leaves. The oven door glowed with warmth as she slid in the tray, and the hiss that followed felt like a promise of comfort to come. While the cookies baked, Mama brewed mugs of tea that steamed in ceramic cups, their walls radiating a gentle heat against my palms. We sipped slowly, listening to the soft thrum of the oven fan and sharing stories about winters past. I remember her voice gentle and steady, describing how Grandma Elsie once baked fruitcake that lasted through a week-long storm, how Charlie had tried to dunk a cookie too soon and spilled his milk in a puddle on the floor. When the timer finally sang its cheerful ring, we pulled the golden cookies free and let them cool on a wire rack, their spiced edges crisp and inviting. I broke off a corner of the first one and let the warmth and sweetness flood my senses, feeling the cold of the day melt away in that single bite. By the time the sink was rinsed and the mixing bowl stacked in the cabinet, the house felt cocooned in a quiet glow that no weather could touch. When the wind howled outside and the house felt more cavern than home, Mama turned to an old trick she learned from her mother, heating bricks in the stove for bedtime comfort. After the supper dishes were done, she'd wrap each brick in a towel and tuck them into the oven's embers until they glowed softly through the fabric. I waited in my robe by the stove, peeking through the oven door to see the orange warmth radiating from within. Once the bricks were ready, she carried them carefully to my bed and slid them under the covers before pulling the quilt back in place. I'd press my fingers against the towel-wrapped bricks and feel heat seep through, chasing away the chill that lingered in the mattress. The heavy blankets that otherwise felt stiff and cold smoothed into something pliant and welcoming, as though the sheets themselves were breathing gentle warmth into my bones. I'd climb in, hugging my knees to my chest so the bricks could share every inch of their heat with my tired body. Sleep came quickly with that ember glow beneath me, and I dreamed of glowing fireplaces and golden afternoons. Even when I grew and left home, the memory of those brick warmers remained a touchstone proof that human ingenuity and a loving hand could outsmart winter's bite. On nights when the cold felt most oppressive, I still imagine that faint orange glow beneath my quilt, a reminder that warmth can be coaxed from even the simplest elements. There was something deeply comforting about the hiss and pop of the hot water bottle as I filled it one frigid evening. The old rubber bottle, slightly stiff from years of use, took shape as I loosened the stopper and poured in steaming water straight from the kettle. I could hear the faint echo as the liquid met the cold interior, and the bottle's surface warmed beneath my hands. I wiped away a few droplets before twisting the cap securely, then wrapped it in a soft flannel cloth that had belonged to my grandmother. Tucking it at the foot of my bed, I felt a surge of anticipation. This simple ritual always turned a freezing mattress into a haven of warmth. As I climbed beneath the quilt, the heat radiated upward, filling my toes and ankles first before easing its way into my back and shoulders. I shifted until the bottle settled snugly against my calves, the gentle weight a reminder of safety and care. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, but in that moment it sounded distant, muted by the promise of warmth under my blanket fortress. I closed my eyes and felt a wave of gratitude for that humble rubber companion, a nightly guardian against winter's bite. Even now, when the air grows cold, I remember that first whisper of heat and the peace that followed, proving that sometimes the simplest comforts leave the warmest memories. I often woke before dawn to find the world outside transformed into a glittering tapestry of frost etchings, each window pane a silent canvas painted overnight by unseen hands. The morning light was faint, just a pale wash of gray that filtered through the glass and set those icy filigrees aglow. I pressed my forehead to the cold pane, marveling at the intricate patterns that spread like fern leaves or delicate feathers across the surface. My breath pooled in a soft cloud, blurring the designs until I could trace them with a fingertip. The glass felt brittle under my touch, and tiny crystals scattered like fairy dust at my knock. I stood there, mesmerized by the way each swirl and loop caught the faint morning glow, as though the frost had captured the first glimmers of sunrise in an endless whisper of light. In those quiet moments, the rest of the day felt suspended. No clatter of boots, no rush of buses, only the hush of a sleeping house, and the slow promise of warmth that waited just beyond the pane. When the bell finally summoned me to life beyond those windows, I turned away with a small ache in my chest, as though leaving a fleeting world behind. But I carried that fragile beauty with me, letting its memory warm my thoughts through the long walk to school. And even now, whenever I glimpse frost patterns on glass, I remember those dawn hours when winter revealed its secret artwork delicate, transient, and hauntingly beautiful in the hushed prelude to another cold day. Take a breath. We've only scratched the surface. Subscribe to keep uncovering what's hidden. The blizzard of '67 arrived like a silent invasion, blanketing our town in layers of white so deep that even the streetlights seemed submerged beneath the snow. It began on a Thursday afternoon with gentle flurries that hinted at winter's fury but gave no real warning of what was coming. By the time Friday morning dawned, drifts had piled against our windows until we could barely glimpse the world outside. My father grabbed his shovel and set to work carving a narrow tunnel from the back door through the garage, the walls rising above my head as I followed him step by careful step. Inside the house, we lit every candle we could find and brought down the old oil lamp from the attic, its warm glow paling in comparison to the wind's howling song against the roof. School was canceled for days, and the radio crackled with updates that always ended with the same gentle reminder to stay safe and stay warm. Neighbors checked on one another with casseroles and loaves of fresh bread, forging impromptu potlucks in living rooms illuminated by lantern light. I remember the hush that settled over everything, a kind of peaceful stillness that invited stories and shared memories by the fire. My mother brewed pots of spiced tea that permeated the house with cinnamon and clove, while I helped braid extra bread dough to bake on the wood stove. Outside, snowplows labored to clear main roads but never reached our little side street until the storm had passed. When the plow finally rumbled through, it felt like a triumphant parade. We emerged into a world transformed footprints marking the paths we had made, and the promise that even the fiercest storms could be weathered together. After the storm's roar finally faded, the neighborhood emerged into a world of soft white contours and quiet camaraderie. I bundled into my patched coat and set out to check on Mrs. Crandall, who lived 2 houses down. Her walkway was buried so deep she could barely glimpse her front step, but when she opened the door, her smile was like a beacon through the swirling light. She pressed a loaf of warm rye bread into my hands, crust steamed and fragrant, and insisted I stay for a cup of cocoa before trudging home. The kitchen was lit by a single bulb dangling from the ceiling, and we huddled close at her small table while she recited tales of past blizzards, each one worse than the last, she claimed with a wink. Outside, footprints crisscrossed the drifts as neighbors ventured out, lending shovels and sharing jokes about the snow that refused to let go. I watched Mr. Epstein emerge from his house, braving the cold with a wool cap pulled low and a nod of thanks when my father cleared a path to his car. These simple acts of kindness stitched our community together like the quilts Grandma Elsie made, each patch a story, each stitch a promise of care. When I finally made it home, loaf in hand, I carried more than bread. I carried the warmth of shared effort and quiet friendship that lingered far beyond the storm's passing. In the dim light of our kitchen, the old tabletop radio sat on a chair so its antenna could stretch toward the only window not sealed by plastic. When the power went out during the blizzard, that battered set became our lifeline, its wooden case rattling as I cranked the volume knob with frozen fingers. The dial glowed faintly in the lantern light, and each station click felt like a small victory in the hush that had fallen over the house. Crackles of static filled the air before a voice emerged, tinny yet reassuring, reading road closures and weather warnings. I perched on a stool beside Mama as she held her scarf tight around her neck and scribbled notes on a scrap of paper. The announcer's words wove a tapestry of caution and care, reminding us that neighbors were digging out driveways and that emergency shelters at the church hall would open at dawn. Between updates, the radio fell silent, the static expanding until the hiss felt almost musical, like whined through chimes. Those interludes taught me to listen for every nuance. The sputter when electricity dipped, the distant hum when the public broadcast signal struggled through the storm, and the sudden clarity when news broke through the white noise. Even after the storm passed, I treasured that radio ritual. It reminded me that even in the deepest quiet of a winter night, we were not alone. We had each other, and we had that steadfast voice guiding us through the cold. And though today I rely on phones and screens for updates, I still remember the warmth of that crackling signal and the way it knit my family together in the most silent hours of the storm. When our street finally felt navigable again, it wasn't any official crew that brought the first breath of normalcy, but a small parade of neighbor-driven plowing parties. My father, clad in his heavy parka and wool cap, led the charge each evening after supper, shovel in hand, carving a path deeper into the drifts than the city plows had managed. Behind him came old Mrs. Crandall, guiding her own snowblower with a determined hum, followed by Mr. Epstein on his riding mower, outfitted with a makeshift blade. We formed a convoy of kindness under the glow of lampposts, the hiss of plastic window kits rattling in time with the roar of engines and the scrape of metal against pavement. Children on sleds cheered from the sidewalks, bundled faces peeking from scarves as they offered hot chocolate in thermoses and enthusiastic encouragement. Every shovel stroke felt like a chorus note in a community song, rhythmic, purposeful, united against winter's stubborn hold. As our procession turned corners and cleared porches, I remember feeling proud of our improvised brigade, each family playing its part without fanfare or applause. Street by street, house by house, the snowbanks retreated, coaxed back into orderly piles at the edges, and the world regained its familiar shapes: mailbox posts, driveway curves, even the crack in the sidewalk where I'd lost a mitten last year. By the time we finished our nightly march, exhaustion and camaraderie warmed us more thoroughly than any parka or stove ever could. We stood together under the frosty sky, breathing clouds of celebration into the night air. And for a moment, winter felt less like an adversary and more like a story we were writing together, one shovel, one engine, one shared triumph at a time. The hillside behind Mr. Luby's house was our kingdom every winter afternoon, a steep slope that glowed white and beckoned with promise of speed and laughter. I remember lugging my Sledan old wooden runner my father had restored one spring up the slope while Carol Ann carried her tin lid, scratched and dented from years of adventure. We climbed step by careful step, each foot sinking into cold powder before we found firmer ground. At the top, we paused to catch our breath and savor the view. Rooftops dusted in snow, telephone wires heavy with ice, and the distant church steeple standing watch over our frozen realm. Then came the thrill of the descent. I would sit, brace my feet against the runners, and push off with a practiced shove. The sled lurched forward, carrying me through wind that lashed my cheeks and made my eyes water. Below, the ground blurred into a swirl of white and brown as I steered with gentle shifts of my weight, heart pounding with each bump and dip. Sometimes I dared to lean back and let the sled slice straight down before pulling the edges with all my might to carve a graceful arc. On one particular afternoon, Carol Ann and I raced side by side, our voices lost to the roar of speed, until we both came to skidding stops at the bottom, breathless and laughing so hard our mittens flew off. We gathered them up and trudged back up the hill, footprints marking our path like an invitation for endless repeats. Those rides taught me about fearless abandon and shared joy, how winter could feel like a great adventure rather than a test of endurance. And whenever I feel the chill creeping in today, I close my eyes and remember that slope, the gleam of the snow, and the rush of downhill freedom. Let that one sink in. When you're ready for the next mystery, hit subscribe. When the morning radio crackled back to life, it signaled more than news of cleared roads and lifted school closures. It was a lifeline of normalcy after days cocooned in winter storm. I remember the relief in my mother's voice as she tuned the old wooden set, filling our kitchen with the steady voice of the announcer, who told us which routes were passable and when mail delivery would resume. Outside the window, sunlight sparkled off clean sidewalks and chimney smoke curled toward the clear blue sky. I watched my father don his favorite cap again and head out to fetch the morning paper, each step sounding crisp against the settled snow. Inside, Mama poured mugs of coffee and hot chocolate, the rich aroma chasing away the last of the storm's hush. We leaned in close to the radio, hanging on every word about community efforts, volunteer crews, and the expected warming trend that promised an end to the ice's stubborn grip. Neighbors drifted in and out of our kitchen, their cheeks pink from the cold and their laughter sharing updates on who had finally cleared their driveway and whose roof still held drifts waist high. That simple gathering around a tabletop radio felt like a reunion of every household on our street, each voice adding to the tapestry of shared experience. Even as technology has moved on, those moments remind me of how something as small as a broadcast could knit people together in warmth, forging bonds that outlasted the storm itself. And every year, when winter returns, I listen for that same crackle and hum, hoping to recapture the comforting ritual of community news and shared hope that carried us through the deepest freeze. There was a magic in capturing fresh snow to turn it into a treat that felt like a secret shared between winter and childhood. I remember setting a clean bowl on the porch rail early one morning, letting it catch the pure white flakes as they drifted down without a single footprint to mar their surface. When I brought that bowl inside, the snow looked fluffy and untouched, a blank canvas waiting for transformation. Mama scooped it into a larger bowl, then added a generous pour of sweetened condensed milk and a splash of pure vanilla extract. The cold mixture hissed and hissed as the warm liquid met the snow, creating steam that rose in soft tendrils and filled the kitchen with a scent so sweet it felt like promise. I stirred gently with a spoon until the snow took on a pale cream hue and the texture thickened into something almost like ice cream. The first spoonful felt like catching winter itself in my mouth. Each bite was cold against my tongue but melted instantly into a rush of sweetness that warmed my belly from the inside out. We sat at the kitchen table beside the wood stove, watching the steam curl up from our spoons as we ate in companionable silence. Outside, the world was a glittering landscape of white and ice. But inside that small kitchen, snow ice cream felt like summer's memory tucked inside winter's heart. Even now, whenever I taste something cold and sweet, I close my eyes and remember the way hope tasted in that childhood kitchen bright, fleeting, perfect in its simplicity. The furnace room was my secret refuge whenever the rest of the house felt like a glacier corridor. There, behind a heavy wooden door, sat the old coal furnace, its iron body glowing ember red above a pile of ash. I learned early to approach with caution, stepping carefully over the slate threshold so my boots would not slip on the scattered cinders. When the furnace door swung open, warmth billowed out in a soft roar that chased away every ounce of morning chill. I would stand there in stocking feet, feeling the heat seep into my ankles and rise through my bones until my toes tingled with relief. The walls of the small room radiated heat long after the furnace fan clicked off, and I pressed my palm against the rough brick, imagining the fire dancing inside like a hidden hearth. Sometimes I carried my breakfast bowl in with me, sipping the last drops of cocoa or oatmeal while the door remained ajar, letting that gentle furnace glow chase the chill from my fingers. Outside, the air still held winter's bite, but in that narrow space between kitchen and basement, I felt cocooned in a secret warmth no draft could penetrate. Even Mama trusted me to slip in briefly on the way to school, knowing I would never tarry too long. To this day, whenever I pass a furnace grate or feel the gentle hum of a heater, I recall that ember room, how it held back the cold like a guardian, how each ember and coal dust fleck seemed to promise that no winter, no matter how fierce, could ever outlast a spark of warmth. In our house, each winter, plastic sheeting on the windows became a sign that the cold wind would soon surrender its bite. I remember Mama carefully smoothing the clear film over each pane, using a hairdryer to seal the edges until the plastic grew taut and whisper thin. The process felt almost ceremonial as I watched her glide the tool along the corners, the heat shrinking the film until it clung to the glass like a second skin. When she finished, she would tap the film and it would sing a faint note, proof that it worked like a shield against drafts. Inside, the air felt still and gentle, no longer pierced by the slightest gust. I pressed my cheek to the window and traced the outline of a bare tree outside. The world beyond softened as though seen through a dream. In that moment, the plastic was more than a barrier. It became a lens that framed the quiet beauty of winter without its harsh edge. It allowed warmth to pool near the windows instead of rushing out, giving Mama's quilts and my own blankets a fighting chance. Even on the coldest nights, when the wind rattled the window frames and snow pounded the siding, I felt a steady calm, knowing that thin film held back the storm. Though it never looked glamorous, I grew to love the way those windows held a gentle warmth, a reminder that simple ingenuity and loving care could tame any chill. Whenever I see old movie scenes of families huddled indoors during storms, I think of our own shrunken pains and the peace they brought to our winter dreams. Late one night, I awoke to a hollow silence and the faintest drip echoing through the walls. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the sound repeated once more distant yet insistent. I slipped from my quilt and padded down the hallway, my slippers whispering against the cold floor. Mama's voice came from the bathroom, hushed with worry as she held a candle above the sink. The pipes had frozen somewhere in the narrow section behind the wall, and every twist of the tap only produced a hollow clang. I stood beside her while she gently applied a warm towel to the pipes beneath the basin, murmuring reassurances to coax the ice to melt. We took turns wrapping hot water bottles around the exposed plumbing and standing in the cramped space as steam rose in little clouds that caught the candlelight. Outside, the wind rattled the windows as if urging us to hurry. After what felt like hours but was only minutes, we heard the blessed rattle of water trickling through. Mama smiled in relief and flipped the tap until a tiny stream of lukewarm water flowed. We let it run for a moment, watching the drip grow into a steady drip, then a sputter, and finally a gentle, steady stream. I helped her pat the pipes dry and wrap them in a blanket of old towels before we crept back to our bedrooms. That night I learned how fragile the warmth of home could be when winter set its icy grip on unseen corners. Even now, when I turn on a faucet and hear the rush of water, I'm reminded of that midnight race, the soft hiss of melting ice, and the comfort of shared effort that saved us from a frozen catastrophe. Sunday afternoons in winter brought the church social at the old community hall, a gathering that blended warmth and fellowship in equal measure. I remember stepping through the heavy wooden doors and into a room lit by swinging fixtures whose glow danced across long tables draped with faded tablecloths. The midwinter chill clung to my coat until I hung it beside a row of my neighbors, each hook heavy with wool and cotton. But inside the hall the air pulsed with laughter and conversation. Women in cardigans carried covered dishes meatloaf, scalloped potatoes, and platters of cheese cubes that rolled like pale pebbles across the cloth. Children clustered in corners with board games they played by the light of oil lamps, their giggles echoing off the walls. In the center of the room, a buffet table groaned under the weight of casseroles and pies, the steam from which mingled with the scent of pine boughs placed as simple centerpieces. I stayed close to Mama as she greeted friends and offered slices of her signature cherry tort, its crust flaky and sweet with a hint of almond. The minister's wife read aloud a passage from the Bible, her voice calm and steady, reminding us that faith could outlast any storm. When the hymn began, voices rose together in melody, filling the hall with a gentle harmony that felt like a shield against the cold night outside. Afterward, neighbors lingered in small clusters, sharing tips on preserving porch pickles and reinforcing storm windows, the practical tied to the heartfelt in every exchange. As I stepped back into the moonlit drive home, the memory of that communal glow stayed with me, a testament to how warmth is as much about people gathered together as it is about heat generated by stoves and heaters. January often felt like the heart of winter's reign, when the novelty of snow had worn thin and the cold pressed in like an uninvited guest. I'd wake to a gray sky that seemed heavier than any other, the landscape drained of color except for the occasional berry-bright cardinal perched on a bare branch. The routine of bundling into layers and trudging through chilled air became a test of patience more than survival. By mid-month, even the promise of spring felt distant, a whispered rumor rather than a certainty. Mama noticed the mood settling over the household and would declare a warmth day. insisting that we all break from chores to gather around the fireplace. We'd pull chairs close to the hearth, our scarves and mittens cast aside in a pile like discarded armor. I'd stack logs on the glowing coals, feeling the heat wash over my face, and Mama would bring out a tray of spiced pear slices, heated until their juices bubbled. The soft crackle of burning wood filled the room and chased away January's gloom until laughter returned to our voices. We shared stories of past winter soft, the year the creek froze so solid we skated until sundown, or the time a sudden thaw turned sidewalks into rivers of slush. Each recollection felt like a stepping stone back to warmth, a reminder that January's icy grip would loosen in time. And when I finally stepped back into the world beyond our door, the cold no longer felt oppressive, but simply part of a cyclone chapter of a story that always turned toward renewal. Valentine's Day at school always arrived with an unexpected warmth, a bright spot amid January's lingering chill. On the morning of the 14th, I carried a small paper sack pinned with heart cutouts, each one hiding a secret note or candy that I and my classmates had carefully tucked inside. The hallways smelled faintly of construction paper and old pencil erasers as we delivered pink envelopes to lockers before the first bell. At recess, we gathered in little circles on the icy playground, passing around heart-o-shaped cookies baked by Mrs. Crandall, their sweet cinnamon scent swirling through the frosty air. I remember trading my peanut butter-oni sandwiches for Carol Ann's cheese slices, each swap sweetened by giggles and shy glances. In the classroom, our teacher read a poem about kindness and friendship, her voice soft against the hum of the radiator. We hung paper chains on the bulletin board loops of red and white that fluttered when the winter draft whispered through the window. There was something tender in those small acts, passing out valentines, sharing treats, and scribbling messages like, "You are special," or "Thanks for being my friend." For a day, the cold couldn't freeze our spirits. Even the stiff coats and wool scarves felt lighter, as if warmed by those simple tokens of affection. When I climbed back onto the bus at day's end, heart pockets full and cheeks bright with laughter, I understood how even the smallest gesture could thaw the most stubborn frost. Valentine's Day taught me that warmth comes not only from the hearth but from the shared kindness we offer one another, a lesson I carry with me every February 14th and beyond. Sundays in late winter held a special ritual when Dad slid his thick boots on and loaded the car's trunk with empty glass jugs bound for the sugar shack at the edge of town. The air smelled faintly of thawing earth, even under layers of snow as we set out before dawn, the headlights cutting swaths through fields dusted in frost. At the sugar shack, a clapboard building warmed itself over a roaring wood fire, and the air inside shimmered with steam and the sweet scent of sap bubbling in iron kettles. I watched in wonder as Dad dipped a ladle into the amber liquid, its surface rippling like liquid gold, and drizzled it over fluffy pancakes stacked high on a tin plate. Each bite felt like sunshine captured midwinter, a burst of warmth and sweetness that spread through me like a gentle wave. Children darted between tables, their laughter mingling with the hiss of boiling sap and the crackle of burning logs. Outside, we gathered buckets of sap from tapped trees, their trunks scored with neat spouts that dripped clear sap into waiting pails. The frozen ground around our boots crunched underfoot as we worked, the sugar shack's warmth beckoning us back inside with each frozen step. Afterwards, we sat shoulder to shoulder at rough-hewn benches, peeling back cloth napkins to reveal sticky fingers and satisfied smiles. On the drive home, my mind replayed the syrup's burnished color and the way it glistened on warm pancakes, proof that even in the depth of winter there were small miracles of renewal. Those Sundays reminded me that sweetness could be coaxed from cold and stillness, and that shared labor and simple treats could warm more than just the body, they could nourish the heart. I often found myself gazing out the kitchen window at the skeletal forms of my mother's flower beds, their outlines traced in frost, as if nature had taken a pencil to every stem. Inside, the radiator's warm breath curled through the room, and I sat at the table sketching what would become spring's first blooms. With a steaming cup of tea in hand, I imagined the daffodils bursting through thawed soil, their yellow faces turned toward the sun, and the tulips standing tall in proud rows of color. My pencil moved across paper as I mapped out where each plant would go once the last of the snow melted. I thought of Mary's little greenhouse behind the barn, where she coaxed hyacinths into early bloom under glass panels, and of Grandma Elsie's stories about spreading fresh manure in the garden before the freeze. Outside, the trees stood bare, their branches heavy with ice crystals that caught the morning light and scattered it like stardust. I pressed my fingertip to the cold glass, tracing the frost's pattern as if it were calling me out into the world beyond. In my mind's eye, I saw green shoots breaking through dark earth, the rich scent of damp soil rising on a gentle breeze, and the promise that life would return in a riot of color and scent. For all winter's trials, those quiet days of planning offered hope. They reminded me that beneath the hush of snow lay a world waiting to awaken once more. And even as the wind rattled the window panes, I felt a kind of warmth in my chest, a gentle certainty that each frozen month held the seed of future blossoms. A pause is good, but the secrets don't stop here. Subscribe and stay close. The first time Carol Ann and I braved the country lane for a sled ride past our houses, it felt as though we were racing through a fairy tale bound by fields of snow. We dropped down from the crest of the hill where the road bent around the cornfield, our sleds carving twin grooves in the fresh drift. The cold air rushed past our cheeks, turning them rosy as we whooped our delight into the horizon. At the bottom, the lane split between rows of dark, leafless stalks that stood like silent sentinels, their bare shapes a stark contrast to the unbroken white that stretched beyond them. We parked our sleds under a frost-etched fence post and followed footprints toward the old barn, where rays of afternoon sun streaked through broken slats and dust motes danced in the beams. Grown-ups had long ago leased the barn's loft for hay storage, but the lower stall was empty, save for a dusty feed trough and the echo of our laughter. We stood in that hollow shell of wood and bone, our breath drifting in little clouds, and imagined sledding through grand caverns or racing through snowy city streets. When the sun dipped low, we climbed back onto our runners, pushing off into a world rimmed with gold light. The wind carried the faint clatter of distant church bells, and for a moment the world felt vast and ours alone. By the time we reached home, the sky had blushed pink and purple, and the dusk air held a promise of calm. That ride taught me that winter's frozen lanes could lead us anywhere. Our imaginations dared through fields, beneath barns, even into the heart of dreams, reminding me that childlike wonder could thaw the deepest chill. My grandmother Elsie's quilts were miracles of warmth stitched together by hands that knew every secret of comfort. I remember sitting by her side in her little sewing room, the air thick with the scent of cotton and lavender from bags she tucked between the folds. She spread a patchwork quilt across her lap, a mosaic of faded florals, soft plaids, and stripes that once belonged to dresses and aprons long since worn thin. Each square held its own story. A scrap of my mother's wedding dress, a tidy rectangle from Mama's favorite apron, a bit of cloth Father used to patch his work shirt after an all-day job at the garage. Grandma Elsie guided my small fingers as we pinned pieces together, her needle threading in and out with a steady click that sounded like a heartbeat. When the nights grew cold, she draped those quilts across my bed, and I would slip beneath the layers until only my head peered out, cocooned in every stitch of love. And then there were the scarves she and Mrs. Crandall knitted when the winter winds whistled through the town. Mrs. Crandall's scarves were all pastel stripes. Each row worked in memory of neighbors who had lent a hand, while Grandma Elsie's were robust cables twisted from homespun yarn that felt as strong as faith itself. I wore them in hothouse colors of russet and mustard and moss green, feeling the heft of shared generosity draped around my neck. Those hand knits and quilts reminded me that warmth wasn't simply heat, it was the gentle insistence of caring hands, the promise that no winter chill could ever reach the heart wrapped in stitches of devotion. Even now, when I pull a worn scarf around my throat or rest beneath an old quilt, I feel the echo of those quiet afternoons and the steady pulse of love woven into every fiber. There was a science to understanding cold that went beyond layers and quilts, a lesson I first learned when Dad explained wind chill on a frosty morning. We stood at the edge of the driveway, my breath swirling in little puffs, as he pointed to his outstretched hand and asked me to feel the difference between still air and the breeze that whispered through the gap in the fence. He had set up a simple thermometer outside the kitchen window and another on the porch, and when he compared the two readings, the drop in temperature startled me more than any January freeze. "That's wind chill," he said in his patient way. "How the wind steals heat from your skin faster than still air." He showed me how to cup my hands and hunch my shoulders against the gusts, teaching me to move deliberately when the wind picked up, lest I underestimate its sting. Over time, I learned to read the sky for signs of an icy breath, a darker shade to the clouds, a sharper crackle in the bare branches overhead, and to anticipate which routes to avoid on the walk to school. The lesson extended to everyday chores: how to angle the shovel to cut through packed snow, where drifts might hide icy patches, and when to rest by the furnace grate before pushing on. Even now, when I step into a brisk breeze, I recall Dad's quiet demonstration and the way knowledge warmed me as effectively as any scarf. Understanding winter's hidden forces became part of my armor, a reminder that respect for nature's subtle power was just as crucial as any mitten or coat. As the calendar turned toward February, thoughts of spring still felt like distant flickers in the endless white expanse, but the promise of midwinter festivities helped carry us through. I remember the church basement transformed for the annual winter fete, long folding tables dressed in crisp white cloths, strings of colored lights humming above, and the faint scent of pine boughs tucked into every corner. Families arrived in bundled groups, cheeks rosy and scarves tied just so, eager to trade stories over jigsaw puzzles and card games spread across polished tabletops. The highlight was always the bake sale, where rows of platefuls sugar cookies sprinkled in red and pink, brownies so fudgy they stuck to the paper doilies, and cups of thick fudge hot cocoa invited small indulgences that felt almost reckless in a season otherwise ruled by rationed cocoa and simple porridge. I stood in line with Carol Ann, clutching a nickel in my mittened hand, eyes widening at the chocolate-dipped pretzels arranged like jeweled crescents. When at last I held my presea-heaping RSVP cookie garland of peppermint barky, slipped into a corner by the radiator to savor each bite, its peppermint shards crackling against my teeth and thawing my fingers with every melt-in-mouth morsel. Around me, laughter rang out as neighbors challenged each other to card games and children scavenged for paper snowflakes taped along the walls. The crowd's warmth seeped into every frozen joint, and for the first time that season, I felt the chill retreat like an old friend bidding farewell. That fete taught me that even in winter's darkest stretch, community celebrations could spark brightness and rhythm back into our days, reminding us that together we could kindle warmth no storm could ever extinguish. The evening before Christmas always felt charged with anticipation, as Mama and I transformed the kitchen into a sanctuary of gingerbread and spice. I waited at the counter in my robe, the wood floor cool beneath my slippers, while she mixed flour and sugar with cinnamon and ginger until the air filled with the heady scent of winter festivities. Our rolling pin, worn smooth from years of use, flattened the dough into sheets that gleamed faintly under the kitchen light. We cut out shapestries, stars, little men whose button eyes begged for decoration, and slid the trays into the oven where the heat glowed like a reverent promise. As the cookies baked, I brewed mugs of milky cocoa, stirring in a spoonful of marshmallow fluff until the surface frosted into soft peaks. Steam curled above each cup, carrying the aroma of chocolate through the workroom. Every few minutes, Mama opened the oven door with careful hands, the hiss of warm air greeting me like a chorus of carolers. When the timer chimed, we retrieved the golden cookies and let them cool on wire racks, their edges crisp and inviting. I traced icing lines onto each treat, dotting buttons and trimming tree branches, while Mama hummed a familiar tune that drifted through the frosty windowsill. Outside, snow fell in silent flakes, the world hushed in white. Inside, Our cozy cocoon pulsed with warmth and purpose. By the time the last gingerbread man was iced and lined up on the platter, I felt as though we had captured Christmas itself in a dozen sweet shapes. Each bite promised memories of laughter, flickering lights, and a season's gentle glow. The night air held a hush that only deep winter nights could conjure as a small group of carolers gathered beneath our street lamp, their breath rising in frosty clouds with each note. Carol Ann and I stood at my doorstep, wrapped in layered coats and woolen scarves, listening as friends from church took their places on the snowy packed sidewalk. A lantern swung gently from Mr. Luby's gloved hand, casting a warm halo across their music books. When they began to sing Silent Night, their voices wove together in soft harmonies that felt like a warm blanket draped over the cold world. Each carol drifted through the neighborhood, touching frosted windows and stirring memories of hearth and home. I watched Mama press her gloved hands together, her eyes shining with tears of quiet joy, and I felt a lump in my throat as the melody carried me back to candlelit vigils and church pews warmed by shared faith. Neighbors stepped outside, lingering on porches and in doorways, nodding in time or softly tapping along like a gentle drumbeat. Even the wind seemed to pause, letting the music fill the night before tinkling past rooftops once more. When the carolers finished, there was a moment of profound calm, no applause. Only the lingering hum of harmony and the memory of voices joined in goodwill. I slipped out onto the porch to offer cookies and mugs of hot cider, and one by one, we exchanged quiet thanks and smiles that glowed brighter than any Christmas light. That snowy night reminded me that song could thaw the frostiest corners of our hearts, binding neighbors together in a shared moment of beauty and hope that outlasted winter's longest night. The church doors creaked open into a hushed world of candlelight and whispered prayers, and I felt the cool stone floor under my boots as I stepped inside for midnight mass. The nave glowed in soft pools of golden flame, each candle placed with deliberate care along the aisle and on the altar, their light dancing across stained glass windows etched with saints and angels. My breath rose in a gentle mist as I joined the procession of families filing toward wooden pews, the air heavy with the scent of beeswax and pine boughs draped overhead. As the organ's first note soared, I pressed my mittened hands together, the cold forgotten in the warmth of shared faith. Hymnals lay open on the pew rack, their pages brittle, and my voice found the familiar words before I even glanced down. Outside, snow swirled against the windows like slow motion, but inside, every note carried comfort, echoing off stone pillars and vaulted ceilings in a cathedral hush. When the priest spoke of hope and renewal, his words felt woven into the candlelit tapestry around us, promising light even in the darkest hour. I watched Mrs. Crandall across the aisle, her shawl wrapped tight and her eyes bright with reverence, and I knew we were bound not only by winter's chill but by this moment of communal grace. After the final blessing, we lingered in place, allowing the silence to settle sacred pause before stepping back into the night. I stepped outside into the frosty air, the warmth of the Mass still glowing in my chest, and felt the hush of midnight snow invite reflection rather than dread. In that consecrated stillness, I understood how faith could outshine the cold, lighting a path through the longest, darkest nights. New Year's Eve carried its own quiet magic, a promise of fresh beginnings whispered through the glow of the fireplace as I gathered with family in the living room. We sat on well-worn armchairs and sagging couches arranged in a gentle circle, mugs of steaming cider warming our hands while the old clock atop the mantel ticked inexorably toward midnight. The radio played soft instrumental music, the tune familiar from every New Year's past, as strings of twinkling lights reflected in the polished frames of family portraits. Each photograph held a frozen moment from winter's long ago. First snowman built in the yard my brother could barely reach, Carol Ann and I bundled in hand, knit scarves, and Mama smiling against a backdrop of frosted windows. As the minutes dwindled, we shared whispered resolutions more like hopes than vows, a small wish for health, a gentle prayer for kindness, and a quiet promise to cherish simple moments. When the clock finally chimed 12 times, we raised our cups in a silent toast, letting the warmth of cider fill the sudden space where words might have felt too loud. Outside, distant fireworks crackled like thawing ice, and I peeked through the window to watch colorful sparks bloom against the winter sky. In that instant, I felt connected to every neighborhood that rang in the new year, each home standing against the cold in its own flickering circle of warmth. Slipping back inside, I nestled among my family, grateful for the steady glow of togetherness that carried us into another winter's night. Dinner leftovers took on an unexpected charm when the cold settled in for the long haul. After the meal dishes were cleared, Mama would transfer any remaining casserole into a shallow baking dish and sprinkle a fresh layer of cheese or breadcrumbs on top before sliding it back into the oven's gentle heat. The kitchen transformed into a scent of rosemary and simmered meat that drifted through the house and beckoned everyone from their corners. I'd set the table again by the window, its panes smeared with condensation from the warmth within, and we'd gather around the familiar mix of tender vegetables and savory sauce that tasted richer the next night. The corners of the baking dish held browned bits that crunched delightfully under the fork, and the steam that rose carried a perfume of comfort rather than novelty. Conversation flowed easily as we tucked into our plates a second time, sharing stories of chores completed and small victories like managing the budgeted coal supply or perfecting the draft stopper under the front door. Even Charlie paused between bites to comment on how the flavors had deepened and married overnight into something new. Outside, the wind drummed a steady rhythm against the glass, but inside we felt cocooned in warmth born of repeated routine and quiet cooperation. By the time the last spoonful vanished, the table felt polished by shared satisfaction and the hum of simple domestic triumph. Those moments taught me that when resources were scarce and days stretched cold and gray, returning to what was known could yield unexpected solace. Leftover casserole reminded me that warmth could be found not only in flames but in the steady pulse of family life, where each reheated bite spoke of continuity, care, and the ability to find renewal even in the most unassuming places. The deep hush of a snowbound evening brought its own kind of cabin fever, and our living room soon became a confessional for the day's small trials. We gathered around the coffee table, quilt-covered like a patchwork island in the center of the room, and spread out board games whose cardboard squares looked impossibly bright against the dim glow of the lamp. The roll of the dice felt heavier on cold nights, and laughter echoed louder when someone shouted surprise at an unexpected turn. Charlie confessed how he'd snuck an extra cookie before dinner. Mama owned up to secretly adding an extra log to the stove just to watch the flames dance, and I admitted I'd peeked at the radio schedule hoping for a snow day announcement. Each revelation came with a burst of laughter and the soft click of clocks ticking through the slow hours. Outside, drifts piled higher, but inside, every shared story thawed a bit of the winter's grip. Grandma Elsie's quilt warmed our shoulders while Mrs. Crandall's knitted throws cushioned the sofa under our elbows. The tea kettle hissed familiar invitations from the kitchen counter, promising more warmth whenever the next confession needed soothing. In that circle of voices, the cold felt distant, replaced by a steady rhythm of camaraderie. We passed the dice, the playing cards, and the memory of the day's small triumphs and missteps, weaving them into the fabric of the night. By the time we called it quits and tucked each piece back into its box, the house felt brighter and larger than before, its walls infused with every giggle, whisper, and gentle confession that made winter evenings something to treasure. Rest your mind, you've earned it. But when the next veil lifts, be here. Subscribe. There was a time in midwinter when the sun shone so bright against the fresh snow that even the cold seemed to sparkle. I remember stepping outside with a pair of improvised goggles fashioned from darkened cardboard, held in place by elastic borrowed from my mother's sewing kit. The glare was blinding at first, but once my eyes adjusted, the world transformed into a crystalline cathedral of light. Each snowdrift glowed with 1,000 tiny prisms, and footprints left behind looked like fleeting silver ribbons. I walked to the edge of the frozen pond behind Mrs. Crandall's house, where the ice lay thick enough to carry my weight. The surface was so smooth it felt like glass, and I knelt to touch it, feeling the cold pulse beneath my fingertips. Dragging on my skates, I rose and pushed off, gliding across that mirrored expanse as if floating. The wind whispered through the bare oaks at the pond's edge, carrying distant laughter and the soft clink of skates against ice. For those precious moments, the world felt suspended between winter's hush and its dazzling brilliance. When I finally slowed to a stop, my breath floated in clouds that caught the sunlight and shimmered like tinsel. I tucked my skates under my arm and headed home, the glare still dancing in my mind. Even now, whenever the sun breaks through a cloud on a snowy day, I squint at the brightness and remember that afternoon the way winter could sparkle so fiercely that even its cold felt touched by wonder. After the dinner dishes were washed and the house settled into a quiet lull, we gathered around the television's satan old black and white box that glowed like a portal against the dark wall. The show we watched flickered between static and welcome images, casting a jittery light that danced across our wool socks drying on the floor vent beneath the screen. I sank into the armchair, pulling my feet toward that grate where warmth pooled like a secret treasure. The television's glow and the vent's heat combined into a cocoon of comfort, and for a moment the world beyond the living room vanished. Mama sat beside me in her knitting chair, needles clicking as she added another row to my scarf, while Dad leaned against the back of the sofa, his arm resting on the armrest and his eyes reflecting the screen's flicker. The program, perhaps a Western or a variety show, played out across the room. But my attention was on the gentle hiss of the heater and the soft shuffle of our feet. When the picture briefly disappeared in a burst of static, we waited patiently, knowing the channel would return moments later. Outside, the wind rattled windows and shook the doorframe, but inside we felt shielded by that fragile screen and the vent's steady warmth. Even today, when I slip on thick socks and settle in front of a television, I remember that blend of soft heat and flickering light, how it felt like magic against the long winter nights, and how those simple rituals wove their way into a memory warmer than any blanket. When the VCR finally arrived at our house in 1986, it felt like unlocking a treasure chest in the middle of a stark winter. Dad brought it home one evening after work, its cardboard box still sealed with packing tape and emblazoned with the word video in bold letters. We carried it into the living room, where the old television perched atop a wooden stand like a relic awaiting activation. Mama unpacked the machine with ceremonious care, wiping away the dust and setting it next to the TV, then plugging it into the wall with a demonstration of household alchemy transforming wires and dials into moving pictures. Our first rental was E.T., and when we popped the tape into the slot, the screen flickered to life with dust motes dancing in a beam of extraterrestrial starlight. The heater vent at our feet puffed warmth upward, and I cradled a bowl of buttery popcorn, its salty steam mingling with the room's cozy glow. As Elliot and his alien friend fled through cornfields under a summer moon, I marveled at how a winter's night could feel as vivid as that sunlit adventure. The static buzz that accompanied tracking adjustments only added to the charm, reminding me that magic often arrived with small imperfections. When the credits rolled, the world outside the window was pitch black and biting cold, but inside our home pulses with possibility and wonder. That VCR taught me that warmth isn't just about temperature. It's about stories that carry you beyond the frost, about shared popcorn kernels and storylines that light up the darkest nights. Even now, when I hear the click of a remote or the whir of a DVD drive, I'm transported back to that first tape proof that technology and togetherness could turn a freezing night into a heartwarming memory. Skating under the rink's flickering lights felt like stepping into a private moment suspended between winter's chill and a budding warmth I'd never known before. Harold and I met by the boards that year me in my hand-to-my-down skates that pinched my ankles, he and boots borrowed from his older brother. The ice was freshly resurfaced, smooth and gleaming like polished glass, and our breaths drifted in little plumes as we pushed off together. Harold offered his hand first, steady and sure, guiding me into a gentle glide that felt more like flying than falling. We traced slow circles under the glow of sodium lamps, their light softening the world into sepia tones. At the center of the rink, he leaned closer and whispered, "You're doing fine." And I felt a thrill pulse through me stronger than any winter gust. We talked in hushed voices about music on the radio, his plans to fix cars at the garage, and my dreams of travel words weaving a fragile bond that felt as delicate as frost on a window pane. When I wobbled, Harold's arms wrapped around me until I righted myself, and the steady beat of his heart against my cheek banished every doubt. As the evening wore on, the ice grew speckled with the tracks of our laughter and conversation, each loop forging memory in the cold surface. When the cold finally pricked our noses and fingers, we paused at the edge to share cocoa from a thermos, the steam warming our faces as we rested. I took his hand again before we skated off the ice, our footprints fading beneath the next cast of skaters. In that moment, I understood how love could thaw the harshest winter and how a simple date on a frozen pond could leave its warmth lingering long after the season ended. There was an unspoken ritual each month when Mama would bring down the stack of bills and lay them out on the kitchen table, our breaths mingling with the faint scent of last night's stew as we prepared for the ritual of reckoning. The envelope holding the heating bill felt heavier than the rest, its weight a reminder of winter's unrelenting teeth. Dad would settle into his chair wearing his worn cap, and Mama would slide the bill toward him, her fingers smoothing the crease where she had folded it closed. We leaned forward as he opened it, scanning the numbers by the soft glow of the single overhead bulb. The total always felt high, but over the years we learned to interpret each line: the cost per therm, the charge for service, the little increase when the mercury dipped below zero. Mama clipped coupons for coal delivery, while Dad reserved their woodpile from the fall's gathering, the two of them balancing resources, like experts engaged in an annual dance. I watched them divide the month into phases: days when the furnace roared, evenings when we banked the fire and huddled by the heat register, mornings when we layered under quilts until the stove could catch up. We clipped sleeves of paper coupons from the local grocery and saved them for the winter utility discount, a small victory earned through organized thrift. When the firewood ran low, Dad would hitch his coat and head into the woods behind the property, returning later with saplings cut and stacked for drying. As a child, I helped bundle kindling and carried buckets of water to the stove, feeling the weight of responsibility folded into each chore. By the time the next month's bill arrived, we had already planned adjustments, lowering the thermostat by a degree or two, airing blankets under the sun's faint warmth, or inviting neighbors to share the glow of our living room. In those careful negotiations, I learned that warmth was not only measured in price, but in ingenuity and family solidarity. The blizzard of '78 arrived without warning, barreling in one silent night and burying our town under a fury of wind and snow that felt nearly biblical. I remember waking to an eerie stillness, the furnace's steady hum replaced by the hollow whistle of wind through the shutters. My father peered out the back door and found drifts taller than the porch roof, the snow piled in cold waves against the siding. He grabbed his shovel and set to work carving a path to the garage, each scoop of white resistance heavier than the last. Inside, Mama lit every lamp she could find, filling the rooms with soft candlelight that fought the shadowy gloom. Charlie and I bundled ourselves in layers of blankets and watched from the living room window as neighbors emerged, bundled like hushed figures in white cloaks, joining the laborious choreography of shoveling and plowing. Time lost meaning. Hours passed in rhythmic shoveling and shared cups of hot tea that steamed in dancing spirals. Our street formed a quiet procession of lantern-lit faces and sweat-smudged cheeks that glowed against the wind's icy assault. When the snowplows finally crested the hill days later, their sing-song blades carving through the drifts, the world felt reborn in stark contrast: mailboxes ray-erected, driveways unveiled, and tire tracks winding toward distant horizons. We emerged blinking into the pale morning sun, everything crisp and pristine as though untouched. In the aftermath, the urge to rebuild warmed us more than any stove could. We cleared debris, lent shovels, and shared casseroles in front yard potlucks that felt like victory feasts. The blizzard of '78 taught me that even the fiercest storms bow to human resolve and community spirit, that when winter's harshest breath descends, its power is matched only by the warmth we forge together. That winter, our telephone lines froze solid in the bitter cold, turning every call into a small adventure fraught with static and suspense. One morning, Mama picked up the receiver and heard only a hollow hiss before the line fell silent, as though the world beyond our walls had been sealed off by ice. We tried again, learning that each ring brought nothing but a tinny echo and occasional crackle of static that sounded like distant thunder. Undeterred, Dad bundled into his coat and set out for the telephone pole at the edge of our yard. Climbing the short ladder with gloved hands steady on the rungs, I watched through the window as he tapped the frozen wires with a small mallet, listening for the snap that meant the ice had fractured. When the first sinewy crack split the air, he called down a triumph that echoed across the snowfields. Back inside, we gathered around the wall-mounted handset, breath held as he dialed the party line that connected half the neighborhood. That familiar mix of voices, Mrs. Crandall's soft greeting, Mr. Epstein's polite cough, broke through the static like a cherished melody. We listened to the latest news of road clearings and warming shelters, each word a gift of connection in the frozen hush. Over the next hours, neighbors joined our impromptu switchboard crew, taking turns thawing wires with hot towels wrapped around pliers and trading cups of cider to ward off the chill. By evening, our street's telephone network hummed back to life, stronger for its shared rebirth. I learned that communication is a fragile thread, easily snapped by winter's might, yet resilient when woven through collective effort and care. Even now, when I hear the faint dial tone, I remember those frozen lines and the warmth that flowed through every successful call. There is a moment in late winter when the world seems to hold its breath, poised between freeze and flow, and I have always cherished that first drip of spring's return. I recall standing on the front porch one morning and hearing it, a tentative drip, drip, drip against the eaves, as if the sky itself were sighing in relief. The sun was pale but insistent, its rays striking the roof and loosening the grip of frost that had held the shingles all season. I watched as tiny beads of water gathered at the gutter's edge, then broke free and splashed onto the hardened ground below. Beneath that simple drip, I sensed a promise rolling in. The end of layered coats, the softening crust atop drifts, the slow uncovering of grass and gravel alike. Over the following days, the snowbank shrank, revealing the crooked outlines of last autumn's leaves and the first brave shoots of crocus pushing through damp earth. I ventured out without so many layer-sluice scarf. Single sweaterin felt a cautious warmth on my cheeks. The sidewalks, once hidden under white, reappeared in muddy ribbons that squelched beneath my boots, and I discovered broken shells of ice that sparkled like forgotten crystals. Neighbors emerged with brooms and shovels, sweeping paths and collecting piles of debris that winter had deposited. Children traded rubber boots for galoshes and splashed through puddles formed where snow had melted faster. In every drip and every muddy patch, I recognized the cycle of endurance and renewal, how winter's grip could loosen, making way for green and growth. That delicate thaw reminded me that hardship is not eternal, that patience can coax warmth back into the world, and that every droplet of melting ice carries the seed of new beginnings. Mud season arrived like a slow exhale, melting snow giving way to a world both familiar and unexpectedly slippery. I remember stepping onto the sidewalk one afternoon, my boots sinking into a soupy mix of slush and thawed earth that clung stubbornly to their soles. Each step required balance and a careful pivot to avoid a sudden slide into ankle-deep puddles. The water shimmered with reflections of bare branches overhead, and I found myself navigating a maze of water-filled ruts rather than the crisp, clean paths of winter. Carol Ann and I took to clipping garden gloves over our hands for splatter protection as we stomped through the yard, testing the soil for softness and feeling small sprouts just beginning to push into the light. Molehills rose like miniature islands in the muck, and the air smelled of damp leaves and warming soil ascent that felt like promise after months of frost. Neighbors hauled out shovels once more, this time to clear clogged drains and gutters, their laughter mingling with the soft squelch underfoot. Inside, Mama's quilts and blankets dried slowly on chairs pulled near radiators, their cotton fibers freshening against the damp chill. The transition from ice to mud taught me to embrace imperfection, to find joy in the messy threshold between seasons, knowing that each slip led closer to solid ground. And as I peeled off my boots at the door, clutching a handful of damp grass, I felt a quiet exhilaration, proud that we had weathered winter's extremes and were now stepping into spring's careful emergence. As the last snowbanks gave way to scattered puddles and the air carried more bird calls than wind whistles, I found a quiet contentment in winter's farewell. I slipped on my welly-worn boots and strolled down the old garden path, each step sending ripples through the lingering frost-thawed ground. The day felt slow and deliberate, the sky taking its time to shift from pale gray to gentle blue, as though savoring winter's final bow. I paused by the rose bushes, their gnarled canes draped with icicles that shimmered like tears of glass. Beneath them, new green shoots probed the soft earth, tentative yet resolute. I knelt and cradled a single crocus bud, its purple petals still furled against the morning chill. In that fragile embrace, I sensed the cycle's promise, hardship yielding to renewal, cold giving way to warmth. Memories of frosty-etched windows, brick-a-warmed beds, snowball skirmishes, and shared stove-side tales drifted through my mind like last year's snowflakes dissolving in spring's sun. The scent of damp earth rose in gentle waves, mingling with the faint residue of pine and wood smoke that clung to the breeze. I breathed it in deeply, letting the inhale carry every season's lesson into my bones. As I rose and brushed soil from my coat, I understood why those winters felt so much harder back then. Each challenge taught me resilience. Each moment of shared warmth forged bonds stronger than any storm. And in the breaking thaw of this 75th winter, I felt gratitude for every frozen chapter that brought me here ready to step forward into a world freshly awakened and forever changed by the beauty and brutality of what came before. That was one layer. Take a moment, then subscribe, and we'll go deeper next time.